Welcome to another video lecture by Utkal Digital Classes. I am your tutor for the course and today we are going to study modern physics. I have divided the modern physics course into two parts, part 1 and part 2, because it's a lengthy topic to discuss, and secondly, there are many questions that come from these topics. Actually, this topic includes the maximum weightage out of all the topics that are available in the paper. So for JEE mains, for NEET, for any CETs that you're preparing, modern physics should be your top priority. If you're preparing for advanced, there are some topics that I will discuss here which might not be that useful for preparing for JEE advanced, but for rest of the examinations these are very essential. So in this part we are going to discuss some important topics which will be atomic structure, X-rays, photoelectric effect, nuclear physics and radioactivity. Let's start with the first topic, which is atomic structure. So many atomic theories were given in order to explain how an atom behaves and what are its constituents. So the first theory that came into prominence was known as the Dalton's theory. Dalton predicted that every material is composed of minute particles known as atoms, which are indivisible, they're stable, and they're electrically neutral. These are the three things that Dalton's theory predicts. As you all know right now that we have found that there are many constituent particles inside an atom. So this theory was soon taken over by something known as the Thomson's model. So what the Thomson's model says is the atom as a whole is electrically neutral because the positive charge which is present in the atom is equal to the negative charge of electron present in the sphere. Okay, so there are as many positive charges as there are negative charges in an atom. Okay, so it tried to explain the charge neutrality of atoms. It told us that the charge is uniformly distributed, the positive charge, and it had some drawbacks. The major drawback was it could not explain the atomic spectra. Thomson's model can be depicted like a plum pudding model in which, or the watermelon model, in which this entire sphere is positive while there are some electrons with negative charge. Because of the drawback of not able to explain the atomic spectra, Rutherford came up with a model of his own. Rutherford actually conducted an experiment in which some alpha particles were scattered by a golden foil. So what they did was there was some radioactive material here, okay, and then alpha particles were emitted from the radioactive material, and they were passed through a gold foil. This is the gold. Let's assume this is the gold foil. They passed through the gold foil, and then there was a zinc sulfide screen was placed on the other side of the gold foil. So what they observed was most of the alpha particles passed straight through. So most of the alpha particles passed straight through. There were some that were deflected slightly from the normal path, and there were very few, but still some that got reflected totally backwards. So from this experiment, Rutherford came out with a model of his own. He said that there are positive charges concentrated at the center. And the center is now what we know called as the nucleus, and it is surrounded by a cloud of electrons. So this was the Rutherford's model, and Rutherford's model was quite successful for a while, but then uh, we were faced with the Bohr's atomic model. So Bohr said that the old classical laws which are applicable to bigger bodies cannot be directly applied to subatomic particles such as electrons or protons that are there in the system. So the Bohr came out with some postulates for his theory, and these postulates said first of all that when an electron is revolving around the nucleus, it is encircling it, or basically it's going in circular orbits, and the centripetal force is provided by the electronic attraction between them. So a Bohr's first postulate, if described in an equation, is nothing but 1 by 4 pi epsilon naught Ze E by r square is equal to mv square by r. This was the Bohr's first postulate. Okay, and the next postulate that Bohr gave was that electrons can revolve only in those orbits in which the angular momentum of the electron is an integral multiple of h by 2 pi. So what this meant was, in terms of an equation, I can easily write mvr, which is angular momentum, is nothing but nh by 2 pi. So these are the two major postulates that you should remember for the paper, because they'll never ask you what the postulates were, but if they ask you for a quantity such as the radius or the velocity or momentum of the electrons in a hydrogen atom or a hydrogen like atom, then you can easily use just these two equations to find everything else out. Okay. Bohr also said that electrons revolve only in discrete circular orbits, and he termed these things as shells. Okay, and Bohr also predicted something about energy. He said that these shells have different energies and different discrete energies, and in order to transit from one energy level to the another energy level, I'll write this down. When you transit from one energy level to another energy level, you give out a radiation, an electromagnetic radiation of energy h mu. So as you can see in this diagram, there are different shells, E1, E2, E3, and so on and so forth. And if an electron wants to jump from one energy level to the another, it has to either get some energy in the form of h nu, or it gives out energy. If it drops from a higher to a lower level, it gives out energy, and in going from a lower to a higher level, it needs some energy. So now with the postulates done, let's look at some of the mathematical analysis of this. The things that you should remember for JEE or any examination that you're giving is, first of all, using these three equations, you can find the radius of the Bohr orbit. What is it? My radius is given as n square h square, h is Planck's constant, n square h square by 4 pi square mk ze square. Okay. What you should remember from this is your radius varies with n and z as this. So my radius is directly proportional to n square by z. Okay. This is what you should take back from there here. And one more thing that I think I should mention here as well. So I'll rewrite this equation. My radius is proportional to n square by z into mu, where mu is the effective reduced mass of the system. Because in this equation, as you can see, there is a mass in the denominator. Sometimes in the questions, what they'll do is they'll tell you that one of the particles has been exchanged with a positron, or the system is a deuteron or something of that sort. In that case, you can't use the mass of the electron that is given here. So what you have to do is you have to use the reduced mass of the system, and then they ask you how does the radius change of the radius of the nth orbital change. Okay, so you should make note of this. Second thing is the velocity. Velocity is also derived using the equations 1 and 2 that I mentioned. Okay, what you see from velocity is velocity varies with z by n. Okay, so here you can find that there is no mass dependence on velocity. Okay, there is no mass dependence. The third thing that you should take a note of is the time period of electron, or you can look at the frequency, because there are things like the momentum you can find easily if you know the velocity and the radius. Similarly, you can also find angular velocity. You should take note of the time period of the electron, time period varies with n cube by z square. So I will write this for your reference again. You should take a note of this. The time period is directly proportional to n cube divided by time period in the nth orbital divided by z square, and here also there is an effective mass mu. So they might vary anything in the question. They might ask you to vary n or z. Z is the atomic number of, it is the atomic number of the atom, whatever atom you're taking, and mu is the reduced mass. Frequency you can find out if you know the T. Orbital current is provided, but no one generally asks it in the paper. Angular momentum you can easily calculate. This was the first condition while starting, that it's proportional to n, and by because it's nh by 2 pi. Centripetal acceleration is fairly simple to calculate. Note here also that it varies with mu. Okay. And similarly, if you go down, you can find some values. I'll write them down. The main thing to notice is the energy. What you find is the potential energy, mod of potential energy, is equal to 2 times kinetic energy in this system, or a hydrogen system or a hydrogen like system. Okay, so my energy varies with z square by n square. Okay, and my potential kinetic energy varies like this. Similarly, my potential energy also varies because energy, both kinetic and potential energy have the same dimensions, and total energy also varies as z square by n square. Now you can ask me what is R. R is nothing but the Rydberg's constant. Now my energy is also, I'll write the proportionality again. So my energy is proportional to z square by n square, but there also is a reduced mass in the equation, because R, your Rydberg's constant will include, your Rydberg's constant R will be including mu. So that is why you should remember this equation. They might because of those questions. For example, if they give you deuterium, or they say that one of the electrons has been switched with a positron or something like that. All right. So this is one thing to remember from these chapters. Let's go down and look a little further. Okay. So the first equation tells you what is the energy difference between two levels or two shells that I just told you about. So the energy difference is nothing but 13.6 times 1 by n1 square minus 1 by n2 square. Here n2 is the final orbital or a final orbit, and n1 is the initial orbit. What you can see here is again the proportionality of the energies has been used, and 13.6 is nothing but the energy for the first orbit. The transition from n is equal to 1 to going to n is equal to infinity is 13.6 electron volts. Okay, so it's the energy of the first orbit. The series have been defined next. So there is something known as the spectral series of hydrogen atom. It has different kinds of radiations in it, and I've listed some names down for you: Paschen, bracket, and P-fun. These are the prominent ones that are asked. So I'll just make a small diagram to explain this. I think you already remember this. Let these be the electronic orbits that are there. So the transitions can happen, like it can happen from E2 to E1, E3 to E1, E4 to E1. Similarly, it can happen from E3 to E2, E4 to E2, and then E4 to E3, if I am only including these ones. So the first one, the first transition is known as the Lyman series. So what is the Lyman series? The series consists of wavelengths which are emitted when electrons jump from an outer orbit to the first orbit. So all the transitions to the first orbit, this one, and this one, constitute the Lyman series. Lyman series. Okay, so it has different members for different values of n2. So n1 will remain the same, and n2 will keep on changing from 2, 3, 4, and so on. Second series is known as the Balmer series. In the Balmer series, your final jumping orbit is second. So these transitions will be for the Balmer series. Here, uh, here n1 is fixed, and S2 and N2 can vary from 3, 4, 5, and so on. Similarly, there is the Passion series, there is the Bracket series, and there is the P-Fund series. So uh, for Lyman, for Lyman, you have N1 is equal to 1. For Balmer, you have N1 is equal to 2. Then you have the Passion series, you have N1 is equal to 3. And then you have Bracket, N1 is equal to 4, and P-Fund, N1 is equal to 5. Okay, this is all you need to remember from this region. Uh, Sometimes they might ask you about the position in the spectrum. So you should remember that Lyman is ultraviolet, by Balmer is in the visible region, and all the rest are in the IR region, infrared region. Sometimes questions have been asked before when they don't ask you uh, what these are, whether it is ultraviolet or visible or infrared. They just give you a range of frequencies or wavelengths, and then they ask you which series does it belong to. So you should go and recall the electromagnetic wave spectrum, in which it's given according to the wavelengths, and it's given according to the frequencies. So you should have a brief idea about what the magnitudes of the frequency and wavelength are for the different regions. One point to note is the total number of possible transitions is n into n minus 1 by 2 from any nth state. If the effect of nucleus motion is considered, so what you need to do in these things, the reduced mass comes into the picture, which is what I mentioned before. So my Rn is nothing but my Bohr radius, which is the radius for the first and n1 orbit, and into n square by z into m by mu, because now we need to use the reduced mass. And similarly, En is given by this form. So let's look at two more equations before moving on to the next part. The first is the equation of reduced mass, which is m big M small m by m plus m. So there are two masses, m1 and m2. The equation for reduced mass is very simple. You have 1 by mu is equal to 1 by m1 plus 1 by m2. Also, the Rydberg's constant changes because it depends on the mass. If your mass of nucleus is also included, and there are different constituents in the atom, then we see that my Rydberg's constant should be divided by a factor of 1 by m plus m. Now let's move on to the next part of the lecture series, which is that of X-rays. Now let's begin our discussion on X-rays. X-rays are produced by bombarding high-speed electrons on a target of high atomic weight and high melting point. Thus, the intensity of the X-ray depends on the current flowing through the filament, and the penetrating power of X-ray depends on the energy of the incident electron. These 3 points are worth noting down, because sometimes a conceptual question might be asked in the paper. So what all the things are required to produce X-ray? in a vacuum tube. Uh, this is an evacuated tube. Okay, and this is an experiment that was done by Roentgen. While performing the experiment, what he did was there was an electric discharge tube, and there was a pressure inside the tube of 10 to the power minus 3 millimeter of mercury, and there was a applied potential of around 25 kilovolt between the cathode and the target. Okay, and then they found that the anode was producing a radiation, and this radiation was later known as X-rays. So what all things are required to produce X-rays? You need a source of electron. You need a means of accelerating them to some high speed so that they have enough energy to bombard on the high atomic weight particles and produce X-rays. And then you need a target on which these high electrons should collide. So these are the three basic things. This was done using something known as the Coolidge method. I will not go deep into the method because it's never asked in the papers. But there are some characteristics of the target that must be there. First of all, your target should have a high atomic weight, as I mentioned, high atomic weight. Okay, it should have a high melting point, which I mentioned. It should also have a high thermal conductivity so that it can remove whatever heat is produced in the process. And there are some examples. Sometimes they might ask you an example of the target that is there. So I'll give you some examples. An example is tantalum, platinum, or molybdenum. Even tungsten can be used to serve as target materials. Let's just look at more details about X-rays. So X-rays can be of two types. The first one is known as continuous X-rays, and the second one is known as characteristic X-rays. So what is the difference between the two spectrum? So for the continuous case, which is provided in the first part, this is the continuous case picture. What happens is you've sent in high speed electrons in the vacuum tube, and they go and they target and they pass close to the nucleus. Okay, so there is a Coulomb attractive force due to the deceleration of the electrons, and thus the energy of the electrons is decreased. Okay, this loss of energy during the deceleration is emitted in the form of some X-ray, because that electromagnetic radiation lies in those energy ranges. Okay, but you should note that there below a minimum value of a wavelength there is no X-ray at all. So what you can see is an electron comes in, okay, it passes really close to the nucleus, okay, and then it gets deflected slightly and it moves with some other kinetic energy. So the final kinetic energy Kf is less than initial kinetic energy. So the energy difference between this is emitted as a X-ray photon. This forms the continuous spectra. I'll just name this. Sometimes they might ask you, I'll show you a diagram in which these things will become clear. Continuous case. Okay, and let's look at the characteristic case. This is known, I'll call this the characteristic case. What is the difference in this process? When the target of the X-ray tube is collided by an energetic electron, there are two kinds of radiations. First of all was given by continuous. In the second case, what happens is when this highly accelerated electron, when it comes in, it strikes an atom, okay, and it knocks out the electron of one of the orbits. Okay, so it's shown in this process here, right here. Okay, the electron just comes in and knocks out one of the electrons from the orbit, due to which there is a vacancy that is created. Now because a vacancy is created, and you know that these energy orbitals are at a lower energy than this, so what happens is an electron from a higher orbit will come and take its position. or fill the vacancy. When this vacancy is filled, the excess energy is emitted as a X-ray photon, which is there. What you know is, depending on which orbit my electron strikes, there will be X-rays of different wavelength. So here we see a graph between the relative intensity and the wavelength for the X-rays produced from a system. There are some things that I wanted to discuss. The continuous X-rays are known as Bremsstrahlung. Or okay, I will start this again. Start this again at 1 minute. No problem. Start this again at 1 minute. So I need you to look at this diagram. This is a plot between the relative intensity and the wavelength of the X-rays produced. There are different regions in this diagram which are crucial for the examination. So the first region is this one, which constitutes the continuous spectra of the X-rays. Note that there is a minimum wavelength after which this process starts, and in this region there is not much information that we can get about the different transitions, because there are no transitions. Only the energy of the coming in electron is being reduced, and the rest of the energy is going out as an X-ray. So this is the continuous case. What I want you guys to focus on are these three cases: K alpha, K beta, L alpha, L beta, and so on and so forth. What do these mean? I previously made the different energy shells for you guys. Okay, so whenever a transition of an electron happens to the first level, something like this or something like this or something from a top level, it is known as the K series. Okay, similarly, when it happens to the second level here or from top, it is known as the L series. So when my n1 is my final n1 was 1, I had K series. For n1 is equal to 2, I had L series. n1 is equal to 3, I had M series. So what you should take down from here is what do the alphas, betas, and gammas represent. So alpha is the first line of the series, beta is the second line of the series, and gamma is the third line of the series. What does that mean? My K alpha means there is a transition from the level 2 to 1. So if I look here, I can easily see that this is my K alpha line, this is my K beta line, alright, this is my K gamma line, and so on and so forth. So this was my first line, which was from the energy level 2 to 1. My K beta will similarly be K beta is equal to transition from 3 to 1. When I want to write what happens for L, the procedure is similar to this. For L, I can again write L alpha is a transition from 3 to 2, and L beta is a transition from 4 to 2. Okay, so if you're given a diagram like this in the paper, now you know what these different characteristics wavelengths mean, and you can easily note these in the paper. You can note these wavelengths and then use them to find the total energy change that was there in the process. Okay, because these kind of questions have been asked before. So the final thing that you want to study with respect to X-rays is something known as the Moseley's law. Moseley studied the characteristic spectrum of the number of many atoms, and he observed that the square root of the frequency of a K line, okay, is closely proportional to the atomic number of the element. Okay, so you have the square root of frequency right here. It is proportional to the atomic number of the element. Why have I written Z minus B? Because I've included some screening. What these terms mean: Z is equal to the atomic number of the target, mu is equal to frequency of the characteristic spectrum which we just saw, spectrum. Okay, B is some screening constant. Note that it's rare that this will be asked, but for the K series, B is equal to 1, and for the L series, B is equal to 7.5, 7.4. Okay, and A is some proportionality constant. So this is what you should remember. Sometimes they will give you a graph where you have to find out what is the relation between frequency and the atomic number. This is the root of frequency. So you should know how to make the graph for frequency versus Z if they ask you in the paper. So basically you will get graphs like this, where this is K alpha, this is K beta. So now let's look at some questions to cement our understanding of what we have done till now. The first question says that hydrogen atom is excited from ground state to another state with a principal quantum number equal to 4. So the principal quantum number is nothing but the number of the shell or the orbit. Then the number of spectral lines in the emission spectra will be. So the number of spectral lines, as I already mentioned before, had a formula. If you don't want to remember the formula, a spectral line is basically a transition between two levels. So it's nothing but NC2. So it's a combination of two levels. So what this gives us is, for our case, this is n into n minus 1 by 2 factorial is equal to 4 into 3 divided by 2 is equal to 6. Okay, so 1 is the correct answer for this. Now I can easily scroll down to the next question. These are all previous year's questions, so these will be essential for you. If the series limit frequency of the Lyman series is VL, mu L, and then the series limit frequency of the P-Fund series is what? So first of all, what is the series limit? Series limit is when your transition is from state at infinity, okay, which is basically the ionized state, to your N1 state. So N2 is equal to infinity, and N1 depends on what level you are talking about. So for Lyman, your N1 is 1, and for P-Fund, your N1 is equal to 5. So now let's look at it. This is Lyman, this is P-Fund. Okay, and N2 is equal to infinity in both the cases. So this is known as the series limit frequency. So you should remember this. Now what we have here is, for the Lyman series, I have H mu L is equal to E naught. E naught is minus 13.6 electron volts. Okay, because it's the standard one. And let's calculate it for the P-Fund series. For the P-Fund series, using these values, we find that H mu P-Fund is equal to E naught into 1 by 25. Here we are using the formula that delta E is equal to R times 1 by N1 square, that is 1 by N2 square. Alright, so we have one equation here, we have the second equation here. Now all you need to do is divide these two equations. So you will get mu L by mu P is equal to 25 by 1. That implies mu P is equal to mu L divided by 25. So this is the answer. Let's scroll down to another problem, this time from X-rays. Remember how I told you that these graphs, these plots might come in the paper. This is another question from the 2001 IIT JEE paper, which is advanced right now for you guys. But advanced in the sense, this question might come in IIT JEE advanced, but it's a very simple question and it's very logical. So let's look at it. The intensity of the X-rays from the Coolidge tube is plotted against the wavelength as shown in the figure. Okay, the minimum wavelength found is lambda c. So lambda c is the minimum wavelength found. Okay, I hope this is clear. Uh, and then you have uh, and the wavelength of the k alpha line is lambda k. So this is the k alpha line. So this is the first transition in the k series. Okay, it's given as lambda k. As the accelerating voltage is increased between the Coolidge tube, you remember the X-ray experiment when there was a target and then there was an anode in the tube. So the accelerating voltage is increased between them. So which of the following happens? Okay, lambda k minus lambda c increases, lambda k minus lambda c decreases, lambda k increases, or lambda k decreases. So how do I attempt this question? First of all, you should know that the lambda of the wavelength of k alpha, it does not depend on the accelerating voltage. Okay, does not depend on accelerating voltage. Why? Because the characteristic X-rays spectra is such that it hits an electron and another electron from a higher shell takes its place. So the energy of the X-ray coming out will only be equal to the difference between those two levels. So it does not depend on whatever voltage you apply externally. Okay. So what this means is C and D cannot be the option. So you are left with the options A and B. Now the minimum lambda of X-rays emitted is given by lambda C. Now as the accelerating voltage V increases, you know that lambda C increases. I already told you this before, but you should, if you missed that out, the lambda C increases as your accelerating voltage increases. Okay. Now as sorry, lambda C decreases, so the energy is increasing. I'll correct myself. The lambda decreases as voltage increases. Why is that so? In the lambda C is part of the continuous spectra of X-rays. For the continuous spectra, your electron should have enough energy before bombarding, and you know that E is equal to hc by lambda. So E is inversely proportional to the lambda, right? So if you are increasing the accelerating voltage, basically the energy with which it is hitting is increasing, so the characteristic lambda, the minimum lambda, sorry, will decrease. Therefore what you know is uh, k alpha does not change with accelerating voltage. So the lambda k minus lambda c, okay, uh, will increase as I increase the voltage, because lambda c is decreasing. Lambda c is decreasing. Okay, this implies A is the right answer. Let's scroll down and do just one more question. An electron beam is accelerated by a potential difference V to hit a material target to produce X-rays. It produces continuous as well as characteristic X-rays. If lambda min is the smallest possible wavelength of X-ray in the spectrum, note that lambda minimum will be in the continuous spectrum range. The variation of log lambda min with the log V is correctly represented. Look, all you should remember is that X-rays are in itself just electromagnetic waves. So how do you approach this problem? You know that the net energy with which this will go and hit the target is E. So if my accelerating voltage is there, I can represent it as E into V. Now this will be equated to hc by lambda, which is the energy of my lambda min. Okay, if I just rearrange this a little, I will get 1 by lambda min is equal to EV by hc. Now you take a log on both sides because you have a graph with logs on both sides. If you take a log on both sides, what you will get is minus ln of lambda min is equal to ln of V plus ln of E by hc. So to get the correct answer, you just multiply both sides by a negative sign. So you will get this. Okay, which is there in the graphs. Okay, what is there? Now the graph is ln of lambda min versus ln of v. Okay, so you know that the slope is negative. You and which in which of the graphs is the slope negative? In this graph, the slope is negative. So that is why C is the correct answer. Now let's discuss the photoelectric effect in brief. The photoelectric effect is nothing but the phenomena of ejection of electrons from a surface when a light beam is incident on it. So in the apparatus that is shown to you, there is a light beam coming in. It falls on a photosensitive material, which is the cathode. Then there is a potential difference between the cathode and the anode, which is known as the accelerating voltage. What this does is it accelerates the electrons towards the anode, which are captured by the anode, and this constitutes the photoelectric current in the system. So what this means is a current is generated when a light beam falls on a material that can eject electrons. Now, how does this happen? Einstein predicted that this is due to interactions between photons and electrons. So photons come in with some energy and they hit an electron. The electron absorbs that energy and gets freed from the metal. Now the electron has some electronic interactions with the other atoms in the material as well. So you need to provide some minimum energy, which we call the work function. Where we need to provide this much energy to the electron just to free it from the electronic interactions around it. Okay, so if my photon comes in with a energy h nu, a part of it goes into just freeing the electron, and right after it is freed, the rest of the energy goes into the kinetic energy of the electron that comes out. So this is the Einstein equation, and I ask you to make a note of this because this is the only equation that you will be using when questions come from this topic. So let's look at some basic plots. Let me first plot the variation of the photoelectric current with potential difference. Okay, in the y-axis there is the photoelectric current and then there is the potential difference. Okay, when I plot this graph, I find that it takes a shape like this. So what does this tell you? This tell you that at zero anode potential there exists a current. Okay, at the zero, at this point, there exists a finite value of current. Next, what you can see is there is a saturation of current. Okay, what else you can see? At a certain negative potential, I'll mark this as V0. At a certain negative potential, you see that the photoelectric current is becoming zero. Okay, we will term this as the stopping potential, and it is the measure of the maximum kinetic energy of the emitted electrons. Okay, so from here you can see that your maximum kinetic energy of the electrons, Ke max, can be equal to E times V naught. Okay, this is the maximum kinetic energy that your emitted electron can have. Okay, the next relation that we can look at is that of the current versus the intensity. You see that the photoelectric current is found to be directly proportional to the intensity of the incident radiation. The next graph is a little more interesting. It's the effect of intensity on saturation current and stopping potential. What you observe from this graph is that the stopping potential and therefore the maximum kinetic energy is independent of intensity. It's the same for two different intensities. Okay, and the saturation current increases with an increase in intensity. So this is I2, this is I1. So the saturation current points increase when you increase the intensity. The next graph that you can look at is that of the stopping potential versus frequency. This graph is a direct consequence of the Einstein's equation for photoelectric effect. What this means is the stopping potential is found to vary with the frequency of incident light linearly. Okay, so the greater the frequency of the incident light or greater is this energy, greater is the stopping potential. We also see that there exists a minimum frequency, let me call it mu naught, there exists a minimum frequency below which there is no stopping potential. No stopping potential is required, as there is no emission of electrons taking place. This is all you need to note from photoelectric effect. Some basic points of photoelectric effect are that photoelectric effect is an instantaneous process. So as soon as the light is incident on the material, photons are emitted. The stopping potential does not depend on the distance between the cathode and the anode. So they might ask you a question in the paper that how does the current vary, and then there will be some conditions given that you increase the voltage difference between the two, you increase the distance between the cathode and anode, how does the current change? So you should remember that stopping potential is not depending on the distance between the cathode and anode. Okay, that's it I think from this. Let's go down. One more key point that I found out for you guys is that the work function is minimum for cesium. Now let's look at two theories of light. One is known as the photon theory, another is known as the matter wave theory. So first we'll look at the photon theory. So the photon theory says that light is composed of photons, and these photons have a speed c is equal to 10 to the power 8 3 meter per second, and this speed is same in all frames of references. The effective mass of photon, as you all know, is non-zero, but the rest mass of the photon is zero. So let me first tell you about the important formulas from this. First one is that of energy. The energy of a photon is given by E is equal to hc by lambda, which is nothing but h into mu. The second is that of momentum, which implies P is equal to E by c, which is nothing but h by lambda. From this relation, you can write lambda is equal to h by p or h by mv. Okay, so remember this as you go forward. Next is the formula for intensity. Now what is intensity? Intensity is the energy of light passing through per unit area and per unit time. So intensity of light turns out to be power divided by area, and the effective mass of photon m is nothing but E divided by c square, energy by c square, which is h by c lambda. The relation, the proportionality constant m is directly proportional to 1 by lambda, has been asked before in an application, so you should take a note of this. Now there are three general cases that are studied when you want to study the force and pressure of a photon beam. So when photons fall on a surface, they exert some pressure, and we call this pressure as the radiation pressure. So there are three basic setups that are there. When photon beam falls on a perfectly reflecting surface, if this is a reflecting surface, the basic idea is your incoming wave of photons will strike and they will get reflected. Let P1 be the initial momentum and P2 be the final momentum. What you do is, to find force, you find change in momentum divided by change in time. Now because it is a perfectly reflecting surface, your incoming momentum is the negative of the outgoing momentum. Alright, so when you do this, you find that force is equal to 2 times P by C. This P is not momentum, this P is power. Okay, the pressure is what is more interesting. The pressure is force by A, which is 2P by Ca, which is nothing but 2I by C. So what you should take back from this is, when photons fall on a perfectly reflecting surface, the pressure, the radiation pressure, is 2I by C. Now let's look at the case of photons falling on a perfectly absorbing surface. The basic physics behind it is the same. You have a beam of photons coming in with a momentum P1, and there is nothing coming out, so P2 is equal to 0. When you find force is equal to change in P by changing time, you find that force turns out to be P by C, power by C, and pressure or the radiation pressure becomes I by C. Note that this is half of the value of the totally reflecting surface. One more is the beam of light incident on a perfectly reflecting surface but at an angle. Again, the basic physics is the same. You have incoming photons, you have outgoing photons. This is the normal to the plane. So by normal concept from optics, what you know is this angle, these two angles are the same. I is equal to R. Now it comes in with a momentum P1, it goes out with a momentum P2. What you do is you find the change in P divided by time or delta T, you find the force. So force for these cases turn out to be 2IA cos theta by C, and the pressure that you should remember is 2I cos theta by C. So if I just summarize the pressure for all the radiation pressure for all the three cases, for perfectly reflecting surface I had 2I by C as the pressure. For perfectly absorbing I had I by C as the pressure, and for angular perfectly reflecting I have 2I divided by 2I cos theta. Cos theta is in the numerator, divided by C. Okay, you should make a note of these 3 points. The next is the matter wave theory, which says that light also behaves like matter. So what this says is your lambda or the wavelength is nothing but h by p, h by momentum, and momentum can be written as in terms of the kinetic energy of the photon. So the first question is in front of you. The anode voltage of a photocell is kept fixed. The wavelength lambda of the light falling on the cathode is gradually changed. So the plate current I of the photocell varies as follows. You are given 4 graphs with I in the y-axis and lambda in the x-axis. Now you cannot solve these questions if you are not clear with the basics of photoelectric effect. You should know that for constant I, constant I, as you go on decreasing lambda, your energy increases. Okay, but your number of photons decreases. Right? It may seem that it should decrease the current, but you should also note that the probability that the photon will be successful in emitting an electron also increases in this case. Alright, so because of that reason, as lambda goes on decreasing, I increases. So you see that only the graph number 4 quick shows this. So another question is in front of you. The surface of a metal is illuminated with the light of 400 nanometers, which is the wavelength. The kinetic energy of the ejected photoelectrons was found to be 1.68 electron volts. Now the work function of the metal is Hc is equal to 1240 electron volt nanometer. So how do we proceed with this? We use the equation from Einstein, which is Ek is equal to Hc by lambda minus phi naught. Note Ek is the kinetic energy. What this means is 1.68 is equal to 1240 by 400 minus phi naught. When you calculate this, phi naught turns out to be 1.42 electron volts. Now we arrive at the last section of today's lecture, which is nuclear physics and radioactivity. As we all know, a nucleus is composed of 2 particles. One is our proton and the other is a neutron. Proton has a charge plus 1, while neutron has a charge 0, and the masses of protons and neutrons are slightly similar to each other, with the mass of neutron being slightly greater than mass of proton. The nucleus is represented by this symbol. For example, you might have seen oxygen, which is 0816. What does this mean? The Z Z corresponds to the atomic number, which is basically your number of protons that are there in the nucleus. So for oxygen there are 8 protons. This is also corresponding to the charge. Similarly, for oxygen the mass number is 16. Okay, this means that the number of neutrons in the system are 16 minus 8 is equal to 8. So the mass number A is equal to the number of protons plus the number of neutrons. What we see next is the average radius of the nucleus. I'll mark this with a star. So the nucleus is assumed to be of the shape of a sphere, and the radius depends on the mass number. So you should note this quantity down, that your radius is equal to r naught into a to the power 1 by 3, where a is your mass number. So you might be asked to find the radius or the volume. When these things are asked, then you can easily use this formula, and where r naught is 1.1 into 10 to the power 15 meters. Now let's look at the next process, which is binding energy. We know that the rest mass of the nucleus is smaller than the sum of the rest masses of the nucleons constituting it. What this means is, if I have 6 protons and I have 6 neutrons, okay, in free space, if I combine them together to form a nucleus of oxygen, then oxygen's rest mass is less than the combined rest masses of these two. Why is this so? This is so because this is due to the fact that the nucleons that we combine together to form the nucleus, there is some binding energy that is released. Okay, so in order to bind these two together, okay, when you bind these two together, some amount of energy is released, and this energy is equivalent to the work that must be done if I want to split it back. If I want to split oxygen back into protons and neutrons, I have to supply some form of energy to the system, and then it will break it apart. So this is where the concept of binding energy comes in. The energy that is released when you try to bind the constituents particles together to form a nucleus. That should be very clear. Now let's look at the first equation. This equation tells you about something known as the mass defect. I'll just erase some quantities here to explain it properly. The first equation is something known as the mass defect. So what is it? It is the difference between the total mass of the nucleons and the mass of the nucleus. What are the first two quantities? Z into mass of a proton plus A minus Z into mass of a neutrons. Here Z is equal to the number of protons and A minus Z is equal to the number of neutrons. So you have the total mass of all the protons plus total mass of all the neutrons minus the mass of the nucleus. And right now I told you that the mass of nucleus is less than the combined masses of the protons and neutrons separately. So mass defect will be a positive quantity. Now if I multiply the mass defect by c square, or the speed of light square, then I get what is known as the binding energy, which is represented in 2. You can see from the binding energy equation that you can multiply, instead of having c square here, you can just write this as the same equation but with 931.5 MeVs. Okay, you should take a note of this unit, because often at times you will be only given masses and you will know what is Z and what is A, and your answers will be asked in the units of MeVs. So these are the equations that you should remember from here. Let's look at the next topic in this section, which is the binding energy per nucleon. Now we are interested in finding the stability of the nucleus. Okay, but we know that the stability does not depend on the binding energy alone. It depends upon the binding energy per nucleon. For example, if I have an atom A which has around 50 constituting constituent particles, and my binding energy is, let's say, 1000. These are just made up numbers. Similarly, I have a atom B which has maybe 500 constituents, and its binding energy is 2000. So it does not mean that B is more stable than A. This is not the case. When I try to find the stability, I have to take into consideration the binding energy for each of the constituent particles that are present. Okay, so for this case, for the first case, my binding energy per nucleon will be 1000 by 50, and for the second case I will have 2000 by 500, which shows that the binding energy per nucleon for A is greater than that of B. Now, what is represented by this? Sometimes you will be asked about the stability of a nucleus and you will be given the binding energy. Then what you need to do is, if a nucleus like oxygen is given to you or carbon, then you need to first make a note of its mass number and then use the formula of stability, or not the formula but the proportionality. Basically, you should know how to calculate the binding energy per nucleon. Now let's look at this graph properly, because sometimes they just give you these graphs in the paper. What is this graph? This graph is binding energy per nucleon in the y-axis and mass number in the x-axis. What you should note is nickel is the most stable, and nickel has a atomic mass number as 62, and what this will result in is that heavy nuclei will break into two smaller nuclei, which will lead to fission, and two smaller nuclei will combine to find a heavy nucleus, which is the fusion reaction. These all will be done so that the binding energy per nucleon is maximized. In both the reactions, the products will be more stable in comparison to the reactants, and this is shown in this process. So you have the first one, which is the fission. Next one is fusion. So a large mass number body breaks down into two smaller numbers in the first case, and in the second case, two small numbers together combine to form a large one. These equations are the nuclear equations that are present, and these will often come in your paper. Next, we look at nuclear collisions and decays. We can represent a nuclear collision or reaction by using this notation. You have some bombarding particle A, it acts on a particle at rest or in motion, and you produce some particles. I have just made two particles here. There can be more particles. These are the processes for a collision reaction. Okay, this is the general notation. Now, what all is conserved in a process like this? There is a conservation of momentum, there is a conservation of charge, and there is a conservation of mass energy. What does mass energy imply? I'll show you. Let A has a kinetic energy K1, X has a kinetic energy K2, Y has a kinetic energy K3, and B has a kinetic energy K4. Okay, this process is simple. A bombarding particle A collides with another particle X, and they together produce two other particles, which are Y and B. So by mass energy conservation, I have the first equation, which is K1 plus K2. Now note that this is mass energy conservation, not just the energy conservation. So the rest masses will contribute. This is MA plus M of X C square. Okay, and this will be equal to K3 plus K4 plus M of Y plus M of B C square. Okay, so So this is the equation that you get when you conserve the mass energy on both the sides of the equation. Next we see that the energy released in any nuclear reaction is known as the Q value of the reaction. So the energy released is the Q value. So I'll just write this down. Q value is equal to energy released. We know that if Q value is positive, then energy is released and products are more stable in comparison to the reactants. However, if Q value is negative, then energy is absorbed in the reaction and the products are less stable in comparison to the reactants. Okay, so Q value is positive implies product more stable, and Q value being negative, product less stable. Now to get a mathematical form for this, my Q value of a reaction can be given as the summation of the binding energy of the products minus summation of binding energy of reactants. Okay, this equation should be clear to you. Now in our chosen example, what are the products? The products are Y and B. So you need to find the binding energy of Y and the binding energy of B, and then you subtract it, and then you subtract the reactant's binding energy from it. Now let us talk about radioactivity and radioactive decays. To summarize radioactivity in one sentence, I would say that radioactivity is nothing but the spontaneous disintegration shown by some unstable atomic nuclei, and this is generally accompanied by emission of certain types of penetrating radiations. For example, the alpha, beta or gamma rays. There are three major types of radioactive decays, which are alpha decay, beta decay and gamma decay. Let's briefly talk about each of them. In the alpha decay process, an unstable nucleus emits an alpha particle. An alpha particle is a helium nucleus. So my X here splits into Y and helium. How does it help X? By emitting the alpha particle, my nucleus, which is X, it decreases its mass energy number and move towards stability. We talked about stability right now. We saw that stability is inversely proportional to mass number, right? Stability is inversely proportional to mass number. So these particles give up an alpha particle, they release an alpha particle and they stabilize themselves. So we can write a Q value for this reaction, which is again very simple. You have the mass of X, your initial value, and then you have the mass of the products. So mass of reactants minus mass of products into C square. You can also note that I have written A is equal to 210 here. This is because we generally see that nucleus having A greater than 210 show alpha decay. For this process, the Q value is positive. Let's go down and revisit a beta decay process. I will zoom out for you guys to understand. Beta decay has two parts. One is called the beta plus decay and one is called the beta minus decay. I'll just make the arrows of how the decay is happening. Okay, so now let's look at the first one. In general, let's look at the beta decay first. In a beta decay, the N by Z ratio, what is N by Z? N by Z is number of neutrons per number of protons. In a beta decay process, the number of neutrons by the number of protons is changed. This decay is shown by unstable nuclei like all the other decays, But in beta decay, either a neutron is converted into a proton or a proton is converted into a neutron. So there are two types. There is a beta plus type and there is a beta minus type. First of all, you should look at this graph. There is a n is equal to z line and then there is a region of stable nuclei. So for any atom falling in these regions, it is quite stable. So it does not need to either undergo a beta plus decay or a beta minus decay. But if I have an atom that is somewhere around here, or if I have an atom which is somewhere around here, then it can easily undergo a beta plus decay or a beta minus decay in order to get in the region of stability. Now, for discussing this, we talk about the first type. In the first type, my n by z, or my ratio of number of neutrons to the number of protons, is greater than the stable one. Let's go down. Okay, I'll mark it here itself. So for the first case which I mentioned, my n by z of this particle is greater than what it should be. So what happens? To achieve stability, it increases its z. So it will increase its z and move into the region of stability. And how will it do this? To increase z, you need to create more protons. So what will happen is a neutron will convert into a proton. So if this is my neutron, this will convert into a proton. Okay, this is known as the beta minus decay. Now, if I look at the beta plus decay, what is there? Let me call this particle as B. Now the particle B has to decrease its Z, but has to decrease its Z in order to go to this point. So what can we do? It can convert its proton into a neutron or decay it into a neutron so that this happens. So what is the equation for it? Let me write it down. My proton will become a neutron plus a positron plus a neutrino. This process is known as the beta plus decay. Now what does this do to the nuclei? As you can see in the beta plus decay, my nuclei X, AZ reduces to a beta particle, a neutrino, and Y. Similarly, in the beta minus, you can see that my X is being converted to another nuclei Y, a beta minus particle, and you have the anti-neutrino. Now, why are they called the beta plus decay and the beta minus decay? Because in the beta plus decay, your beta particle is basically a positron which has a charge of +1. In the beta minus decay, your particle is electron. Okay, so this beta particle is nothing but an electron, and this particle is nothing but a positron. The change that you can see is your mass number remains the same, but your atomic number changes. Similarly, in beta minus decay as well, the mass number remains the same, but the atomic number changes. For the beta plus decay, it reduces by 1. For the beta minus decay, it increases by 1. But all you should remember is what is the basic process happening behind it, which is the breaking up of a neutron into a proton, and in the second case, breaking up of a proton into a neutron. Let's talk about gamma decay slightly. You need not write any equations for this, but the basic idea is that when an alpha or a beta decay takes place, the daughter nucleus is usually in a higher energy state. So such nucleus comes to ground state by emitting a photon or a number of photons. Next, let's quickly review the laws of radioactive decay. And the rate of decay is proportional to the number of nuclei that are still present in a sample. So This is my first equation, which says that the rate of decay or dn by dt of the number of nuclei is proportional to the nuclei that are there. Alright, so what this means is if I have a box with 100 nuclei and I have a box with 50 nuclei, so the rate of decay will be more in the box with 100 than the box with 50. You should take a note of this equation because this is essential. Next, we see that the number of particles or the number of nuclei at a time t is given by this equation. It varies exponentially and it decays exponentially with time. Lambda is called the decay constant. Okay, this is all you need to know from here. If you can use these two equations, you can probably solve most of the questions that are there. Two other corollaries from this are, first of all, the half-life. Half-life is the time it takes for the number of nuclei in the system to become half of the original value. So it's given by a formula ln2 by lambda, which is 0.693 by lambda. And then there is some concept of T average, which is sum of times of existence of all nuclei in a sample by the initial number of active nuclei in the sample, which is nothing but 1 by the decay constant or half-life by 0.693. These equations are also important, but more or less you will be able to do most of the problems if you keep these two equations in mind. Now there is another concept known as activity, which is given by R. So activity of a sample at any instant depends upon the number of active nuclei at that instant. Okay, or basically the active mass. So R decreases exponentially, just like my n was decreasing exponentially above. Okay, and R is not a constant with n, m, and time. While you should note that lambda and T average and half-life are constant. When these three are constant, then R is not a constant. What else is there in this? I think you should remember this because sometimes they ask you directly what the activity of a sample is. So this is similar to what all you have been already studying in chemistry before, so it should not be much of a problem. One more point that you should take a note of is that the radioactive nucleus can decay by two different processes having a half-life T1 and T2, and the effective half-life is given by 1 by T1 plus 1 by T2. Before finishing the lecture, let's do some quick problems. An alpha particle of energy 5 MeVs is scattered through 180 degrees by a fixed uranium nucleus. You need to find the distance of closest approach, and 4 options are given to you. Now, in any nuclear process, remember that energy is conserved. Okay. Now the loss in kinetic energy should be the gain in potential energy. So let me write it down. The loss in kinetic energy is what? 1 by 4 pi epsilon naught Ze into 2E divided by R minimum is equal to 5 into 1.6 into 10 to the power minus 13 joule from the question. Therefore, R minimum is equal to 1 by 4 pi epsilon naught 2 Ze square divided by 5 into 1.6 into 10 raised to the power minus 13. Or if I just substitute the values now, I get 9 into 10 to the power 9 into 2 into 92 into 1.6 into 10 raised to the power minus 19 whole square divided by 5 into 1.6 into 10 raised to the power minus 13. When I solve this, I get that R minimum is equal to 5.3 into 10 to the power minus 14 meter. So the distance of the closest approach is of the order of how many centimeters? If you convert this to centimeters, what will you get? You will get 5.3 into 10 to the power minus 12 centimeters. So if I want to find the order, my order is 10 to the power minus 12. Now let's look at another question. After absorbing a slowly moving neutron of mass mn, a nucleus of mass m breaks into two nuclei of masses m1 and 5m1, where the relation between the masses is given. If the de Broglie wavelength of the nucleus with mass m1 is lambda, then you need to find the de Broglie wavelength of the other nucleus. So how do you do this? I have a mass which was m plus mn, okay, and it breaks down like this. Now, according to the conservation of linear momentum, let me give this the value lambda and momentum p. Let this have lambda prime and momentum p prime. Now, I have to apply the conservation of linear momentum. So that implies p prime should be equal to p. And when I use this, I get that lambda prime is equal to lambda, which is this one. Let's look at another question. A radioactive material decays by simultaneous emission of two particles with respective half-lives 1620 and 810 years. The time in year after which 1/4 of the material remains. Now this is a very good question, because we know that n is equal to n naught e to the power minus lambda t, right? I can write this as n by n naught is equal to e to the power minus lambda t. Now because this is a simultaneous emission of two particles, your rates you are basically going to get n by n naught is equal to e to the power minus lambda 1 plus lambda 2 for the two different processes. So whenever a process is decaying simultaneously, you just add the lambdas in the exponential. You should take this down as a note if a similar problem comes in. Or you get n by n naught, let's say n by 4 n naught is equal to e to the power minus lambda 1 plus lambda 2 t, or log 4 is equal to lambda 1 plus lambda 2 t times log e. Now lambda 1 is nothing but ln 2 by 1620, because that was the half-life. So I have ln 2 as 0.693 divided by 1620 and lambda 2 equal to 0.693 divided by 810. How does this come? The t half-life is equal to ln 2 by lambda. Okay, and half-lives have been given to you. So what do you do next? I'll zoom it out a little. I'll zoom it out and I'll do it on this corner. So I have 2.303 into 2 into 0.3 is equal to 0.693 into 1 by 1620 plus 1 by 810, and I multiply this entire thing by t. That implies if I want to get t, I just solve this equation and transpose everything on the left hand side. I'll get t as 1080 years, which is the first option. Let's look at one final question. All these questions are from past years papers, so they will be a good practice to you. So two radioactive substances A and B have decay constants 5 lambda and lambda. At t is equal to 0, a sample has the same number of the two nuclei. The time taken for the ratio of the number of nuclei to become 1 by E square will be what? Okay, so how do you approach this question? Let me call N1 to be the number of radioactive nuclei of substance at any time t. Similarly, for the second one, I'll call it N2 as the number of radioactive nuclei at the time t. Now N1 at any time t is given as N0 e to the power minus 5 lambda t, and N2 at any time t is given as N0 e to the power minus lambda t. So what do you get? If you divide equation 1 by 2, if you take this, and this is given as 1 by E square in the question, so you get e to the power minus 4 lambda t. Okay, that implies 4 lambda t is equal to 2, or t is equal to 1 by 2 lambda, which is this one. So with this question we wrap up our lesson, and I hope you guys learned something from this. In the next part we'll discuss the other remaining halves of the modern physics, and we'll touch upon semiconductors and communications. Thank you.